Hey everybody, my name is Marshall Lambert. I work for Highmark Health in the Pittsburgh area, and I've been working there for coming up on 4 years now, and I've been heavily involved with our efforts to operationalize FAIR across our information security department.
And my name is Greg Rothauser. I also have been working for Highmark Health, so I'm a relatively recent addition to the team. Prior to this, I was leading a FAIR adoption effort for a Fortune 100 financial services company in New England. So first things first, just want to say good afternoon, everyone. And we would like to say up front that what we're going to be discussing is why we at Highmark Health chose to integrate the FAIR methodology with the HITRUST approach in order to operationalize our risk quantification program. We recognize that not everything that we did is necessarily going to work at your organizations, but this is what worked for us. So with that in mind, we're going to just very briefly discuss where we were coming from. I don't want to dwell on this, but it's helpful to quickly discuss why we chose to go down the path that we did. So I'm assuming that most of us are all pretty familiar with sort of a classic approach to information security, leading to some information security department mission statements and purpose statements that sound like, protect our patients' data in critical clinical systems. Or maybe it's something like safeguard customer data entrusted to our organization. Either way, these kinds of statements are focused on security activity rather than on risk outcomes. So how do organizations go about reporting on the successes and ongoing challenges of those endeavors? So this kind of approach leads to reporting models that we all know has some limited usefulness. We still continue to see them pretty pervasive in the risk community. Like I said, this isn't probably new to any of us in this conference. We're here because we understand that there are limitations to this approach. But it's very easy for us to look at something like this and imagine right off the bat, or even remember some of the questions that arise from leadership when they look at this kind of reporting. So you may get a question like, what does it mean that cloud is likely? Of our 4 high risks, which one of these is the biggest risk to my organization? Or as I like to say it, you've got 4 reds, which red is the reddest red? Is it twice as red as the next red? 3 times as red? It's hard to answer those questions, and it's hard to defend those answers, and it's difficult to provide good decision-making. So sometimes organizations address this by providing sort of a semi-quantified controls reporting. And you get something that looks a little bit like this. So similarly, if we report out in this way, we have additional sort of limitations that we're probably, again, pretty familiar with. Most of us have probably either produced this kind of report or we've consumed it. Now, it looks quantitative, right? We have numeric values. We can compare one against the other, which sort of addresses what we were talking about previously, but it still can raise some questions that we have difficulty answering. So looking at this, you may get asked, well, overall, are we in good shape or are we in bad shape? I see that patch management is red and has a really low score. How did it get so bad? And what exactly does that mean to my organization that it's a 1.8? And I see you have both backup and recovery and email at yellow, but such a large difference in scores. So again, answer some questions, leave some open. So organizations occasionally will try to combine these approaches, but even together, there are some clear limitations. So the first of which, of course, is how do you make well-informed decisions, particularly around things like monetary and effort investment? When your controls aren't connected to your risk outcomes, that becomes very difficult. Additionally, when you look at reports that have a bunch of reds or a bunch of things below 2.0, you have a tendency to want to try to fix everything. And you get this sort of boiling the ocean approach. Right? You wind up with a bunch of simultaneous efforts, each of which is resource starved, and they all struggle to reach their goals. And you wind up with leadership that is really frustrated that you're not making progress, and you wind up with a security team that is getting overworked and probably more than a little burnt out. Now, if any of us have an unlimited budget, we have unlimited resources and unlimited time to throw at these programs, sure, you could do all of that at once. but I have yet to see anybody that's in that kind of situation. So in order to change our results, the first thing we had to look at was, what is our purpose as an information risk function? So this here is sort of how we at Highmark look at our function as an information risk and quantification group. And right off the bat, some things that we made sure that we wanted to put in here is that we identify that we recognize that there are resource limitations, right? We need to do this cost effectively. We also recognize that there are business constraints to account for, right? We're here to achieve business objectives, not get in the way. And then finally, it also acknowledges that there's no such thing as 100% secure and 100% free of risk. We know that there's an acceptable level of risk. We're here to help identify it and achieve it. To get there, we need to understand what threats our organization is exposed to, who's out there trying to get to us, what kind of controls do we have in place that address those threats, and then of course, finally, what is the resulting risk exposure? And this is what we're working to achieve at Highmark. And FAIR alone gets us pretty far along the road, but there are some challenges that we encounter both at Highmark and I've seen at previous organizations. And one key challenge that we're going to focus on here is, how do we connect that control activity, deficiencies, improvements, other changes, back to the risk scenarios and resulting exposure effects? And at Highmark, we found that an integrated approach between the HITRUST CSF and FAIR helps address this challenge. And so what we can produce is something that looks a little more like this. So we provide this kind of information to our stakeholders, not always in this kind of a format, but this is the core information. And so just sort of going through it to describe why we find this important. Now, on the far left side, we've got our loss scenarios, right? This is no longer a big, broad statement like cloud. This is a very specific statement as to what it is that we're concerned about. Moving over, we've got the risk exposure. This takes that high, medium, low and puts it into a language for business, right? Business people understand things like risk exposure, they understand dollars and cents. I think we all know that. That's why we're here. Moving over, we now have this opportunity as we integrate these approaches to connect control improvement to these loss scenarios. So what are the specific controls that we feel can be improved? What kind of programs may we have in flight or proposed? We can also identify who is the control owner for those improvement opportunities, who's going to be collecting the metric, who's putting the project together, whatever that kind of information is. With that, we can also forecast what kind of reduction of risk are we going to get from undertaking this improvement in control. Coupled to that, of course, because we can't have a cost-benefit analysis without the cost, what is it going to cost us to do this? And then bringing it all together, what is the actual value to the organization? What is the return on that investment? Now we can start talking about making informed decisions. It's not just high, medium, lows. It's not 3.5 versus 3.2. We can prioritize how we expend the resources to best address our risk and a means by which to monitor and measure success. So to discuss some of the specifics on how we look at the integration between FAIR and HITRUST, I'm going to turn things back over to my colleague, Marshall.
Thanks, Greg. So we're going to dive a little bit in here about some of the key areas that we see integration opportunity between HITRUST and FAIR. But before we do that, we think it's important to give the audience a bit of an overview of what is HITRUST. And as this is a FAIR conference, many of you might have already found out what is FAIR to an extent at this point, but it is important to give you a bit of a background around the information that HITRUST could provide for us. So HITRUST is an organization that has created a controls framework called the HITRUST CSF. And the CSF encompasses a multitude of regulations and industry standards, including some of the better known ones such as HIPAA, GDPR, and ISO. It's used by a majority of Fortune 20 companies and hundreds of thousands of organizations. And using those data points alone, if I were to run some FAIR-based estimation in my head, I'd guess that some of you in the audience probably already have familiarity with HITRUST. And what HITRUST brings to the table for your organization is rather simple. It helps to keep things simple. Highmark has found extreme value in the assess once, attest many approach that HITRUST offers, which saves time and resources for compliance-focused activities. But while that's the initial value proposition for HITRUST, what you may not realize is that HITRUST also brings value to your FAIR program, and that's what we're going to touch on today. So how do these differing methodologies begin to connect? We're going to offer you a high-level look at how there are some overlapping components, but we're really just skimming the surface in this presentation. For a deeper view, you'll need to be on the lookout for the integration white paper Greg and I have drafted with FAIR and HITRUST. We'll have more details on that at the end of the presentation. But let's remember, what does our better risk management approach entail? As Greg covered, it entails understanding of our organization's threats, controls related to those threats, and the resulting risk exposure. So let's talk a little bit about threats. One powerful element of FAIR is uniform risk scenario structure, one of the components of which is threats that are acting upon your organization's assets. And HITRUST has a threat catalog that ties controls to threat events. This sets up for tying your understanding of your organization's controls to the threats and risk scenarios that they control against. Moving into security controls and metrics that measure the efficacy of those controls, one element of FAIR is breaking down risk scenarios into discrete components. Many of you who are practitioners will be aware that more often than not, a cyber risk scenario will be influenced by security control related metrics or measurements. But when you go to collect those metrics, is it always readily apparent which team is responsible for them or which individual on that team is the best point of contact? Is it always readily apparent if the metrics themselves are accurate, appropriately scoped, or appropriately collected? The answers to these questions aren't always yes without effective control governance. And that's an element that we found HITRUST really helps with at Highmark. Another piece where we see potential for integration is in security decision-making. So HITRUST does a really good job of creating useful decision-making constructs for your risk management program and leadership in the form of determining existing security control gaps. This allows you to see which controls aren't functioning effectively and ideally need resources to improve them. But FAIR enhances that decision-making within that construct by providing common language for all stakeholders in the form of financial loss. As we all know, improving controls requires budget, and to effectively communicate to those who are non-cyber employees and may be responsible for allocating that budget, it's important to have a common language. So that common language and reporting around control gap investment, prioritization, and corresponding decision-making may begin to look something like this, the chart that Greg covered earlier. What we're going to go into here is a bit about how FAIR, HITRUST, or a combination of the two contribute to each component on this chart. So firstly, as we already covered, FAIR defines risk in the form of loss scenarios. We can move more towards describing actual events that can occur that stakeholders can understand rather than listing security concerns off for them to consume. Additionally, corresponding risk exposure for such loss scenarios can be presented. And at Highmark, we have found that risk exposure can be calculated more precisely while still maintaining accuracy if the calculation inputs, particularly security control metrics, have appropriate governance around them. With HITRUST, we can define specific control improvement opportunity with defined scope, as well as the individuals responsible for managing those controls. And lastly, moving into the ROI area, prioritization of the control improvement opportunities that we've identified can be determined by the calculated ROI for a particular control investment, which takes into account both forecasted risk reduction and the control cost. Forecasting risk reduction is dependent upon the change in a particular security control's operational metrics. And that's something that's really hard to determine without appropriate governance. If you don't have somebody who's knowledgeable about the control itself, how it's functioning today, what technical ramifications improvements may have, it's really hard to forecast the delta in the metrics you're looking to improve. So the reporting in here results in clear options for decision makers around which security controls they can fund to improve and the risk reduction or value forecasted from those decisions. And as is detailed here, while FAIR provides unquestionable value beyond the benefits your program may realize by simply pursuing the classic cyber risk management approach, leveraging an integration between FAIR and HITRUST even furthers that value. FAIR begins to introduce things like enhanced communication to non-cyber employees or leadership, both in the forms of financial language and translating security concerns into comprehensible loss scenarios, effectively answering the question that many stakeholders will ask, which is, so what? Why should I care about this concern you're bringing to the table? FAIR begins to bring objectivity into assessments and reduces the rampant FUD or fear, uncertainty, and doubt that all too often plays into risk assessment. And it sets up for defensible analysis to support resource allocation decisions. But HITRUST and FAIR together can enhance what FAIR alone offers by connecting risk exposure with controls and ensuring risk scenario inputs that are related to controls are effectively governed. Additionally, working with the two in tandem allows for better and more efficient security control-based return on investment analysis. And thusly, such an integration allows you and your decision makers to understand in even greater detail your threats, connecting controls, and resulting risk exposure, allowing for more informed risk-based decision making and ultimately more effective cyber risk management. If this topic is of interest to you, please be on the lookout for an integration white paper that will be published on the FAIR Institute link website. This white paper is the outcome of a partnership between FAIR, HITRUST, and Highmark Health. This white paper is merely the beginning, though, as this partnership is intended to be ongoing and ever evolving. The white paper will detail integration to a deeper degree, but it also sets the stage for additional use cases and integration opportunity. Ideally, our goal is to define actionable guidance for integration between the two methodologies to result in more effective cyber risk management across the industry. So with that, we're going to invite in two of our other contributing authors, Bryan Cline from HITRUST and Tyler Britton from the FAIR Institute, to have a bit of a Q&A session around the intent of this initiative.
Hello, I'm Bryan Cline, the Chief Research Officer at HITRUST. I've been with HITRUST for quite some time now, since at least mid-2011. And before that, I was a CISO implementing the HITRUST methodology. My role at HITRUST has been in the development and maintenance of the HITRUST CSF, as well as the underlying methodologies and other kinds of tools and that kind of thing to support the implementation of the HITRUST approach. Right now, my focus is strictly on methodologies. The role for CSF development is, my job is basically split into two. So Jason Saul has taken over the CSF development piece, and I have the methodology piece.
My name is Tyler Britton. I'm a cyber risk consultant with RiskLens and fellow FAIR practitioner. I've been with RiskLens almost a year. And my role is to consult, to help organizations learn how to perform FAIR analysis and think about more enterprise level quantitative risk analysis programs.
Great. Thank you both for joining us. I'm going to pose the first question to each of you individually. I'm going to start with you, Bryan. From a HITRUST perspective, what value does your organization expect and hope to realize from an integrated approach between HITRUST and FAIR? I believe you're still on mute, Bryan.
And I believe you're correct. So HITRUST has actually been working towards enhancing our approach to risk analysis for several years. And we did that with the initial introduction of the HITRUST threat catalog. It's, the intent was to focus on the ability of individuals to do risk analyses like, control, gap prioritization, that kind of thing, by looking at threats and how the controls were controlling those threats, right, safeguarding information. And so the natural outcome of that has been a drive towards increased quantification of the approach. So we believe that by leveraging what is arguably the industry standard for quantified risk analysis that the FAIR Institute provides, we anticipate providing significant additional value to the market in the areas that we described in the white paper. For example, corrective action prioritization, risk acceptance, analysis of alternative controls, and other risk-based kinds of decision-making. And so we believe by increasing the value of the HITRUST approach to the marketplace, we also anticipate increasing adoption across pretty much all industries and sectors, including public and private, and domestic and international.
Thank you. Tyler, I'm going to pose basically the same question to you. So from a FAIR Institute perspective, what value do you expect to see out of an integration with HITRUST?
So I think that, one of the primary values here is something that Bryan just touched on, which is the ability to have predefined ways of adopting FAIR. I think is a major benefit. Obviously, countless organizations are already using the HITRUST CSF. It has a controls framework that's there in the maturity controls framework, and having that already in place, and then when our white paper, building out a way to integrate those two together, it provides so much there already that an organization can take and answers questions that organizations might have about adopting FAIR before they need to ask it, right? So you have a white paper that walks you through how to perform this integration, and instead of having to ask these high-level questions about adopting FAIR before you, start on that initiative, like, what's our primary use case here? Why is this valuable to our organization? In this white paper, we answer those questions. And so the ability to adopt FAIR in a way that is integrated into your existing practices is a major value.
Thanks, Tyler. So, Bryan, another question that I have for you, we touched a little bit on in our presentation about how the HITRUST threat catalog is valuable for organizations to tie threat events to their controls. But could you expand a little bit more on the HITRUST threat catalog, what it is, and how it can help organizations understand the threat landscape they face and the controls for those threats?
Sure. So the HITRUST threat catalog, it was intended to help organizations with various types of risk analyses, right? By enumerating a comprehensive set of threats that is at a level that's commensurate with the level of prescription in the HITRUST CSF itself, right? So we'll talk about threats like malware in general. We won't necessarily talk about the latest malware threat that popped up yesterday and that kind of thing. But then we map the HITRUST CSF controls to those enumerated threats. And so by doing that, we kind of complete the process, where you have a threat that exploits a vulnerability in an asset that causes an impact, yada yada, until finally the risk is mitigated by a threat. So we help close that loop, and it helps people understand how much control they have, or how well they're controlling the specific types of threats with the controls that they have in their environment. So future work that we think is going to help enhance this is going to be development of general asset types, typical vulnerabilities associated with those asset types, as well as expanding information on human threats to include things like types of threat actors, motivation, capability, that kind of thing. And the intent is to provide enough information to support a basic approach to risk analysis that's founded on the FAIR approach.
Thanks for that insight. And Tyler, a question that I have for you is, are there any challenges that you've seen at other organizations you've worked with that you feel HITRUST is well suited to answer?
Yeah, well, generally speaking, organizations that are sort of mired in the checklist approach to cyber risk management, a controls framework like HITRUST, is absolutely ideally suited, right? Because you're moving from just checking the box to, hey, let's evaluate the maturity of our controls. Let's actually try and parse out something that's more robust than a binary. We have this in place or we don't. How much do we have this particular control in place? How much value does it actually add to our organization in terms of reducing exposure. And of course, because I'm a FAIR practitioner, I think this is also an ideal opportunity. If you're going to move to something like HITRUST CSF, why not do an integrated approach as well, so that when you're evaluating the maturity of a control, you're also evaluating from a business standpoint the efficacy of that control as it actually functions in your environment. So when I see organizations that are still checking the box, classic cyber risk management, I think HITRUST is just such a low-hanging fruit to significantly increase the robustness and value of your cyber risk program.
Excellent. So Bryan, I'm going to come back to you again. So in our presentation, Marshall mentioned the assess once and attest many approach that HITRUST really provides value on. I was hoping you could take just a minute to discuss a little bit about how that works and how that sets the HITRUST CSF apart from other control frameworks that may be out there.
Okay. Well, assess once, report many. It basically refers to how the granular mappings to the authoritative sources in the HITRUST CSF, things like, NIST SP 853, the HIPAA security rule, GDPR, that kind of thing. How those granular mappings allow the results of a single HITRUST CSF assessment to be used to report performance or relative compliance against those sources, right? And we usually do it through scorecards. In other words, we map the controls to the requirements of these other sources, and you can see how well you're doing in the context of those sources. But we also, in some cases, like within this cybersecurity framework, we can actually provide a HITRUST certification of the level of compliance. I say compliance in air quotes because NIST doesn't like that term because it's a voluntary framework, right? So it's hard to comply with something that's voluntary. Anyway, but basically the certification compliance with the control-related requirements. In this case, for this cybersecurity framework would be how well the objectives that are specified by the NIST CSF core subcategories, how well those objectives or outcomes are being met basically by the controls you've implemented.
Great, thank you. And then I think we have one last question, and I'll throw this over to you, Tyler. So as we talk about ongoing work that this is going to lead to, right, even this white paper that's being published concurrently with this talk is really just the beginning. So as we think of the things that we are intending to work on, what is it that we're looking at that is most exciting to you to work on in that integration between the two approaches?
I guess I'd say I have two answers to that question. One is such a common question that we often receive is FAIR compatible with our existing frameworks or our qualitative program? The answer is yes. And so having a white paper to say yes, and here you go, this is what this could look like as an example, is really exciting. Instead of just having to try and prove every time that question comes up and use examples, we have an example to show. So that's a really exciting opportunity. And I would also say that a second thing I'm really curious and interested to see is where do the conceptual or philosophical differences between something like FAIR and HITRUST, where do those arise? What will those look like? And how do we marry potentially otherwise conflicting viewpoints into an integration? I think that really is the primary challenge and intellectual rigor of an endeavor like this, writing our white paper together. And so I'm curious and excited to see where those differences end up being and how we can find out an approach that works for both.
Great, thank you. With that, I think that we are out of time. And I just wanted to thank, obviously, Tyler and Bryan, thank you so much for your help, not just in putting this white paper together, but in coming here and being a part of this discussion. Really appreciate it. And obviously, thank you to everybody who is watching. Obviously, this doesn't have any value unless there's people to absorb and use it. So again, thank you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your FairCon 2020.